Chapter 3 begins our journey through the cellular level of organization. The cell is the smallest unit of life. This is where living versus non living separates. Things that are non living never make it past the macromolecule organelle level. Things that are living continue through that cellular level and then on to tissues. Tissues make organs, organs make organ systems, and so on, depending upon the complexity of the organism. Now, this podcast focuses on the plasma membrane, which is the outer boundary of the cell. And in this particular video, this is the first of 3 videos you're going to watch about the plasma membrane. And this one focuses on the anatomy, the structure of the plasma membrane. The photo that you're seeing is a basic animal cell. You'll see that it has 3 basic parts. The plasma membrane, which is this outer boundary separating outside from inside, the nucleus, which is this area, and the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is everything between the plasma membrane and the nucleus. It's within the plasma membrane, and outside the nucleus is the cytoplasm. Now, this podcast focuses on the plasma membrane, and there's 2 basic functions of the plasma membrane. The first function is to serve as a barrier. Because it does surround the cell, it separates what's outside from what's inside. And a second major function of the plasma membrane is that it controls cellular activities. Because you're going to see in just a moment that the plasma membrane actually has several different types of proteins embedded within it, and those proteins play a role in cellular functions. Now, the basic framework of the plasma membrane is a double layer of phospholipids. Now, this term phospholipids should sound familiar to you. This was one of the examples back in Chapter 2 of the different types of lipids. Remember that lipids are a category of the macromolecules, and these macromolecules in turn are used to form the cellular organelles, the structures of the cells. And in your lipid examples, you had triglycerides, which were responsible for the long-term energy, insulation, cushioning, protection. And you had the steroids, with the main one being cholesterol, and you had phospholipids. And phospholipids form the plasma membrane. So if you look down here in the diagram at the very bottom, you'll see that the basic framework says a phospholipid bilayer. Bilayer means 2 layers. So there are 2 layers of phospholipids that form the basic structure of the plasma membrane. Now, looking closely at a phospholipid, you'll see that it's got a head and 2 tails coming off of it. This head is polar. That means it attracts water. It's hydrophilic, water-loving, hydrophilic polar head. Then these 2 tails are your actual fatty acid chains. These are the fats. And if you remember fats, remember that fats are hydrophobic, and they are non-polar. So non-polar tails, which are hydrophobic, and polar heads, which are hydrophilic. So that's pretty unique to have both polar and non-polar properties on one single macromolecule, one single structure here. But it's this unique characteristic that makes it such a great barrier. If you'll look back down here at the bottom of the picture, notice how these phospholipids orient themselves. All the polar heads are kind of sticking together in unison, forming the basic outermost part of the plasma membrane. And then you see the fatty acid tails here on the bottom orienting toward one another. So your tails face one another, and your polar heads are toward the outside, and the other layer, you'll notice your polar heads are toward the inside down here. And your non-polar hydrophobic tails orient themselves right in the middle. Well, there's a reason that they orient themselves in this direction. The majority of the fluids outside the cell is water. So H2O is most of the fluid that resides outside the cell. And most of the fluid that's inside the cell also is water, H2O. So you've got water inside the cell and water outside the cell. This is going to pull these hydrophilic heads toward the outside and toward the inside. And since things that are nonpolar and hydrophobic do not mix well with water, you see the 2 fatty acid tails orienting themselves toward one another. So if you have a test question that asks, What is the structure of the plasma membrane? Your answer is phospholipids. Phospholipids are what compose the basic structure of the plasma membrane, and there's two layers. Since there's two layers, it's often referred to as a lipid bilayer. Lipid bilayer. And the characteristics of a phospholipid is that there is a polar head, which is hydrophilic, water-loving, and hydrophobic, water-fearing, nonpolar fatty acid tails to it. And it's the characteristics of this phospholipid that allows it to be a barrier and separate the outside from inside. If we did not have these hydrophobic tails all right in here in the middle, then your waters would simply join. You would have no barrier. So it must be a lipid that will separate the inside from the outside within a cell. Because again, most of the environment outside is water, most of the environment inside is water. So it needs these fatty acid tails, this type of lipid, to create that separation.